Welcome to this Talks at Google virtual event. I'm Jules Wagner, and I'm on the Big Table Site Reliability Engineering team at Google. I am very excited today to introduce our guest, Nadina Galle. She is an ecological engineer, technologist, podcast host, academic, entrepreneur, and now author. Her interest in balancing the natural world with our urban environment is something I think we all need to be invested in. And thankfully, she is here today so we can talk more about why that is. Nadina, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Talks at Google.
Thanks, Jules. Such a pleasure to be here. And thank you so much for taking an interest in my book.
Oh, no, it's like I deal most of the time with just like all these, technical stuff and like making sure like all the bits are all moving around. And it's just so refreshing to be just kind of caught up with your field. And actually one thing is you might see from my I'm not in New York City right now. That's where my office is. But it was supposed to be when I looked at the forecast, it was supposed to be like 90 degrees out. And I said, I can't stay in New York City in this. It's so hard. I don't really know how people do it. 7 days a week. I knew I couldn't do that when I first took my job. Um, and I think it like we have air conditioning, but it barely works. It's like super hard. You're not supposed to have air conditioning over. You're supposed to set it to 78 degrees. So I'm very privileged because I don't have to stay in the city. I can escape to this other property I have. But I really wonder about everyone else in New York City that can't get out in the summertime. And I was wondering, like, what could make life better for those that can't escape these hot urban areas? That's something that you've written about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you said it right there, Jules. The big, I would say the big challenge of our time is how do we keep our cities livable? And more importantly, how can we not just ensure people are surviving, but actually how are they thriving? And I mean, you said it right there. Air conditioning is one of those big solutions that's often touted, but unfortunately, air conditioning alone is not going to get us out of this extreme heat crisis, as you alluded to. The only way to really properly do that is to have more what I call in the book, and as it's known, nature-based solutions, right? These engineering green infrastructure solutions, anything from green walls to street trees to urban forests to mini pocket parks that can actually really help to cool down our streets because we can't all hide out in our homes in the AC, right? People need to commute, exercise outside, work outside. We simply just can't hide away from the heat. We really need to work towards ways to make our streets and our cities cooler.
Yeah, well, you mentioned hiding, and that's exactly what I do when I'm in New York because I'm in the Lower East Side. There's not a lot of trees
Yep.
there. I'm not anywhere near Central Park or anything that like it is. You just walk out my building. It's like getting hit by a wall of heat. Um,
Yeah.
it's very very noticeable there. In fact, I think I think in your book you mentioned how folks were running around and realizing the temperature discrepancy just down in your neighborhoods, which I thought was fascinating because I look at the forecast, it says 90. I would think it's just everywhere. No,
Yeah, yeah, it's up to 25-degree Fahrenheit differences you can feel between the middle of, an asphalt parking lot in the middle of a tree-lined street. 25 degrees Fahrenheit difference. I mean, that for people, as you say, like that could be a matter of life or death for people.
yeah, and I've become more aware in the last week. Yeah, there's no law in New York City to offer air conditioning or cooling. There is for heat,
Hmm,
but things have changed since a lot of these
interesting.
laws went in. Uh, you know,
Interesting.
but yeah, and so uh, yeah, there's so much changing. Even I think last year, heat's one thing, and then I think I came in one day last year, and they said don't come into the office. In my office is in Chelsea in Manhattan, and that was the first time I'd ever had that. It was wildfires, I think, in Canada that
Yeah,
were coming through. Um,
yeah,
and that's like a new phenomenon that I'm not. I think even in 2020, my coworkers in Silicon Valley, they were sending us all these pictures. It looked like Mars in Silicon Valley. It just felt unreal. Um, but there's what can I do to stop this? This is a pretty major thing. Um, like how is like, how are we supposed to like deal with this mentally? Like, what can we do? Can I do
Yeah.
any?
Yeah, I think that's the odd thing, right? Because we think of if we live in an area that's not a wildfire prone area, we tend to think that that's not much of a risk to us. But as we've seen in New York last year with the smokes of the 2023 Canadian wildfires and in 2020, like you mentioned, these ominous, just orange hues and the haze and the air pollution that's just awful for people that are living, sometimes hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from these areas. It's pretty incredible that wildfires are having that large of a geographic spread of impact, you could say. And I know that can feel really, really daunting because the sky is literally feels like it's falling down. There's this orange hue. It feels really ominous. Um, and I think, as I point towards in the book quite often, the answers are in nature, and it's all about bringing nature back into our urban areas, into our urban environments, so that we do have those areas of respite. And one of the ideas that I'm really excited about is this idea of green corridors. So it's actually creating these, commute heavy base, but also for exercise and for take going out with your kids, these green corridors that actually connect, much like a transportation network would in terms of a subway or a tram system or a bus system, actually provides active transport means like bicycles and walking, ways that they can actually commute in these really hot, heavy, smoky, foggy days in a way that feels safe to them. So creating basically this network of green areas, whether that's connecting the existing parks that we already have with really heavily tree-lined streets, and there's a couple other ideas in there. If there's not room for trees in a street, you might be able to do something with green walls. Really thinking about active transport as something that also gets its due and its rightful place in the city, just like the subway or the tram or the bus would, creating that network of green corridors so that in days like you described, people still have safe ways to get around.
That yeah, that would be fantastic. That's almost like in New York, the last 10 years, I think they put in bike lanes because it was very difficult just to bike, but that's a concerted effort. It needs to be a whole network.
Yeah,
If we had a network where I could walk outside, I mean, I hide. Like I look to see where like the sun is on which side of the street, and I'll switch because it can be
yeah,
so hard to
yeah,
be out in an urban area without any of the shading. It is so much more comfortable to be able to walk near trees. That's very
absolutely.
interesting. Yeah. So with you mentioned some of the mental health benefits of that, and you mentioned in the book. So I'll just make sure So one of the reasons Nadina is here is because she, wrote this book, "The Nature of Our Cities," and in the book she mentions uh, something I'd not heard of, where there's some doctors that are prescribing nature prescriptions, which is, I mean, that's so different than our traditional view, especially in the U.S. I know you split time between Europe and Canada, but we so seem to want a quick fix and just give a pill. And this is just a very different idea. Like go out and be with nature. And it turns out that there's benefits to this. Like? I would love that to be more widespread. Do you see that becoming more mainstream? Like, is this just the start maybe of something?
I would think so, definitely. From what I've seen, I'll start with this. Nature prescriptions really are this subset, you could say, of a bigger movement called social prescriptions, which is basically this idea that you can complement any treatment plan, right? So if you're coming in with let's say you're coming in with heart problems, the doctor is not going to say, forget all the pills and all the medications and instead, go out for a 30-minute walk, in a forest every day, but it's meant as a complement, not necessarily a complete replacement of pills, although it can be in certain mental health disorders. There's actually been studies that shown that spending time in nature can actually act as a complete replacement, if not actually have more positive benefits than antidepressants, which I think is really, really quite interesting. But yeah, all that to say, nature prescriptions are definitely hitting the mainstream. I mean, in The UK, you have the National Health Service. They're actually starting to call it the Natural Health Service. Doctors and medical practitioners there are encouraged by the government to actually give out these nature prescriptions. There's in Canada, for example, there are now 4 provinces where the doctor can actually prescribe you a national park pass, which typically has a value of something like $60 or $80 per year. Actually, have a national park pass gives you access to all of these national parks for free. In Australia, they have the same thing where it's quite government supported, and they're encouraging doctors and medical health practitioners to prescribe nature. And that, it's not a one size fits all solution. That nature prescription is going to look very different for each patient. So there's a couple of great resources out there. There's Park RX America, which is a fantastic organization that actually looks at, okay, what are the natural areas around you, and what are some of the accessibility requirements you might have. Perhaps you have a young baby, so you want somewhere where it's paved so you can take your stroller out. Perhaps you have mobility issues, so having paved paths is also important to you. Perhaps you want to make sure that there are bathrooms close by. All of these different like accessibility um, mobility requirements nearby. The medical practitioner will actually sit down with you and say, okay, how can we make this fit into your life? Perhaps it's 15 minutes a day, just sitting outside. Like I write about one example in the book. It was shorter than actually, it was 30 minutes one time a week. This 18-year-old that was dealing with heavy panic attacks. Basically, the doctor said, what do you like to do outside? And it took her a long time to think of something. And ultimately, she came up with, I like to lie down in the hammock that my dad has in his backyard. So that was it. That was the prescription. Every Wednesday, go outside and lie in the hammock. No phone, no book, no nothing. You lie in the hammock and you just look up at the sky for 30 minutes once a week. That nature prescription alone completely cured her of these heavy heart tightness and panic attacks that she was feeling. So it's really quite remarkable what just spending time, and I would argue not just time in nature, but also time with ourselves, right? Creating that stillness and that rest that is so hard to find in today's world.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm actually on the spectrum diagnosed, and I actually Uh, maybe that's one of the reasons why I just like going out into hang out in the woods and just sit around and go to parks. Because I get very freaked out by just being around too much stuff. Whereas I just when I'm out with all the trees and everything, like
Yeah.
it's very calming. So interesting. Yeah. I didn't like that nuance. It's complimentary. To augment. But hey, if it works, for some people, maybe it could be, even more beneficial. Wow, that's amazing. Um, you know, um, a lot of times I think about like, one. So I think one of the things that struck me in your book and the ideas was just how um, we've we're instead of it's kind of like working more with nature instead of kind of trying to subjugate it or kind of bend it to our will. It just seems like a lot easier to try to work with nature. It's already there in supporting
Yeah.
us. Um, uh, but actually, the Internet of Nature is one idea that you mentioned in the book. That's something that that you talk a lot about. It seems like it's almost like the evolution of trees and nature has been around for millennia. We've got these humans in the mix. They've kind of shaken things up, and it's almost like this is like the next step. It's like this evolution of the two parties. Kind of like really cohabitating together and thriving is to be able to take the best of both. That was kind of how I took your Internet of Nature
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah. 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 You nailed it. You nailed it.
Okay, yeah, as a mere technology person, whatever. um, but so another thing, I loved reading about the book was just this highlighting the idea of blindness, like plant blindness was one. I myself, like, I don't have a green thumb or anything. I have a hard time telling, what any specific thing is. I know that's a tree, but I don't know exactly what specific tree. But it turns out that there's a lot of folks that are just like they are pretty blind to the greenery around them, and so I noticed all these like different kind of just almost like blind spots that you highlight. That this blindness, so plant blindness being ones, or just the folks in our communities that are in charge of managing the trees or all the different systems that we have, or the development, what's being developed, and just kind of operating blindly to nature, and not really accounting for it as if it's this resource, but it's there and they're not really valuing it. And so that ignorance almost of plants in the natural world, um, that seems to have there seems to be consequences when we're not aware and appreciating that all that we get from that. So I'm assuming there are benefits to all of these things in the natural world, but that blindness can be such an impediment to all these folks that could really help. Um, so, are there like what benefits do you think are to convey? Uh, could we convey by kind of overcoming this blindness?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. I think there's kind of 2 approaches to this. I think you have the carrot and you have the stick approach, right? The carrot is opening up people's eyes and raising more awareness about the benefits that you say, Jules, nature provides us, the natural world provides us in our cities, right? And that can be anything from these mental health and physical health benefits we just discussed, from giving us shading and cooling in times of extreme heat, providing air filtration when we get that wildfire smog, providing these sponges that literally soak up our excess stormwater, and if it happens, these sewer overflows that can happen in times of extreme precipitation. I really see nature as, the best way to describe it is, the natural worlds provide this buffer for us, this buffer for us to be as human beings, to be able to reflect and get that refuge that we need from the busyness and hecticness of everyday life. But it's also the buffer that's going to help us withstand these climate change impacts that our cities are facing and are going to face more in the future. So the carrot idea is, can we, through these new technologies, whether that's new mapping technologies, whether that's showing the value of these kinds of nature prescriptions, whether that's showcasing exactly and modeling exactly what one individual tree can do for us in terms of cooling our building, and opening up people's eyes to those facts, can we then, in an intrinsic or altruistic way, hope that people, and by people I mean developers, investors, city planners, officials, change the way that we are currently developing our cities? That's the carrot. I'm hopeful. But I think the stick side of that approach might look like something that we've seen, for example, in Amsterdam, where I'm located right now, and as you say, where I spend half my time. Um, Amsterdam is, I would say, one of the world's first green cities. So they systematically started greening their city in the golden age, right, in the 16th and 17th centuries. It's pretty incredible. They had all these rules in place that, this was even dating back to, I think it was the 1400s, that if you actually damaged a tree, you would either get a fine or your right hand chopped off. So they were serious tree protectors because they saw innately already the value of trees. Granted, they used the leaves as food for a lot of the livestock that came into the city, not something that we're still using trees for. But they also really saw the shading and the livability that it added to what was otherwise quite a stinky and smelly city, with its canals and all of the waste in that. They structurally, systematically first started planting linden trees, and then they moved to elms, to actually really help to give structural integrity to the canal sides, the quay sides. I could keep going. Amsterdam has a really interesting green history, if you can call it that. But what I was trying to get to is the stick is that, one of the reasons why the Amsterdam city central, despite it being so dense, is actually still so green today, is because they actually had really set rules in place that if you bought a parcel of land within that canal belt in Amsterdam, you had to green 50% of that parcel. And that is something that I just think it's so simple, and it's something that I believe we could really start adopting. Does it have to be 50%? I don't know. You could also say something like, the footprint of what you build, at least the equivalent of that footprint, if not more, has to be greened or left green on the development that you're planning, which is going to give us also, more space around buildings, so that we have more greenery accessible, also that we don't create these, huge gray landscapes that are really quite depressing to a lot of people. Ultimately, I think the solution probably lies somewhere within the carrot and the stick. Hopefully, it's this realization that yes, the natural world is so good for us in so many different ways. And perhaps these are some tax incentives and urban planning regulations that we can put in place to really start to foster this from the ground up.
Yeah. Wow, it's almost like we kind of like, at least in Amsterdam, they knew inherently in the 1500s that nature was beneficial, and that's amazing that they were able to have rules about that, which is very different than in the US. The like that concept, I don't think I see as much.
Well,
Or
I would actually argue against that, Jules. I think there's certain US cities that have shown remarkable foresight. If you look at the city New York, Central Park, Boston, the Emerald Necklace. I mean, many of these parks, if you look at across the part in London, UK, that kind of trio of Hyde Park and James Park, um, there's remarkable foresight there in actually trying to, through this really kind of Victorian park design, bring a piece of the countryside into our cities. Because even then in the 1800s, it was recognized, wow, these cities are stressful, smelly, um, kind of awful places to be at times. And bringing in the natural world really offers that respite. And then I think that's kind of what's changed now, though, is that it used to be only that. Bring the countryside into the city centers to offer that place of mental healing for its citizens and that piece of livability. But now those limited, park spaces and trees that we have left have to fulfill this laundry list of duties. It's like, okay, well, you got to cool my air, you got to protect me from extreme heat, you got to soak up my excess rainwater, you got to sequester my carbon, you got to sequester my particulate matter. We've got this laundry list of all these things that nature now needs to do for us. And that's okay as long as we have a modern approach to actually enhance and ensure that those places are integrated into cities. And that's where the Internet of Nature or this use of technologies, I think, comes into play.
Yeah, actually, as you were talking about that, because you're right, Central Park in New York is just an amazing foresight investment. I mentioned I'm in the Lower East Side. I actually did a tour at the Tenement Museum right down the street from me, and that actually used to house 7 times as many people, I think, as live in the neighborhood now. But I remember
Wow.
there's a tour where you walk in a preserved tenement building from like it's 100 years that anyone's lived there. It's intact, and they actually pointed out in the tour how all the immigrants, like, they ended up having, like, in the hallways pictures of pastoral scenes. Like, they couldn't get nature in the Lower East Side because it was so far away from Central Park, but they would at least put pictures of nature, you
That
know.
that reminds me, the modern version of that is having all these, when you open up your MacBook or your Microsoft computer,
uh,
the standard screensaver is always some
yeah.
kind of naturescape
That's
or
right.
landscape.
It's like serene serenity, like,
Exactly, exactly.
yeah. No, no, yeah, it's like, even if we can't get actual nature, like, we wanna see, facsimiles, pictures of nature around us.
Well, there's
Um,
actually sorry, one more thing I'll add to
yeah,
that
yeah,
because it's
that's
really
great.
interesting. There's actually really fascinating research that shows that I mean, we've known for a while that if a hospital patient has even a view of trees or nature out of its window, they actually heal X times faster, they take less medication, so that in itself is already amazing. But when that's not possible or when perhaps the patient is less mobile, there's also been some research to show that virtual reality nature, as in taking it in through your virtual reality goggles, can actually have proven benefits as well. So I'm not saying we should all visit, nature in our virtual reality world, but in a really, set circumstances where there's absolutely no other way of getting someone outside, that even can prove to be useful, which is really quite remarkable.
Yeah, I would kinda think that just the memory of what it's like to be inside and being reminded of that. You don't get the tactile,
Yeah, the
just
smells and the
the
feeling and the
smells.
wind in your hair. Yeah,
But at least if it's, like, evoking the memories and giving you it's not that it's not, the same, but hey, again, just like being able just surrounding yourself with that,
yeah, yeah.
I can see the benefits. So what I like is yeah, it's like there's all of these, waking up to this idea that, like, oh, like, we have all these benefits from nature. They can help us solve all these problems that are we can see coming with climate change. And I do love how at the end of the book you kind of like point out, like, you talk about all these technologies that can really help us live a better life, and especially in our urban areas, with nature, that it is possible. which is amazing. And then you also point out that like that's kind of like just a step on the path to where we want to be. But it takes years. Like it takes so long for trees to mature. You need so much patience.
Yes, yes. Yeah, you do. But, the crazy thing is it actually goes faster than you think, and we you can be involved in greening your neighborhood, greening your street, greening your balcony on timescales that feel a lot quicker. Like, there's this fantastic, nonprofit called Sugi. They actually just planted, their what they do is they plant these tiny forests, these pocket parks, and they're meant to do a really high density of planting in a way that actually increases the development of that forest. That typically takes 100 years, actually reducing that down to 10 years in this really distinct way that they plant in this high density. They actually just planted a tiny forest on Roosevelt Island, so just, stone's throw away from Manhattan. And, it shows that, I know it can feel, like, really daunting, like, "What am I gonna do? Plant 1 tree and then wait around decades for it to grow?" There are greening initiatives that you can take part in that, take seasons rather than years, and they can be really beneficial.
Oh wow. Yeah, that's great. Um, so talking about greening and trees. So in the book, you also mentioned at the beginning, you mentioned uh, cities getting a handle on their trees and doing tree censuses, which I'd never heard of. It's, like people census is one thing, but like counting all the trees, there's got to be lots of those. I'm a site reliability engineer. We deal with like billions of users, serving Google serves billions of users. Scale seems like a problem, but it sounds like there's technologies out now that can help cities inventory and count their trees. Um, so what's the real importance? I guess like why should cities be doing that?
Yeah, so a tree census or a tree inventory, as they're known as well, I would say are foundation they are the foundation to effective urban forest management. So as the saying goes, you can't manage what you don't measure. Historically, creating these inventories really required a bunch of manual effort, either from tree technicians or from volunteers, like we saw with the New York City tree census, which has been going on since 1995, actually. Unfortunately, when you rely only on volunteer driven campaigns, it often has a lot of human error. And because it takes so long, because you can imagine how many trees you have in a large city, as you were saying, scale is a big issue, it can often lead to having outdated data. And because of that, it's it's kind of bizarre, but many cities around the world actually lack a comprehensive tree inventory altogether, or they have severely outdated inventories, which basically render them useless. And this is actually really dangerous because we're asking the head of, whether it's the Parks and Rec department or the Urban Forestry department to manage a resource that they actually don't have a handle on. They actually can't even tell you how many trees they manage, where they are, what their species is, what their condition is, their location. These are exactly the kind of metrics that you would take up in a tree census. And this is really where I think advancements in technology are really going to transform this whole process, particularly the rise of what's known as LiDAR mapping. So, LiDAR is essentially when you create a 3D scan or a digital twin, if you will, of all of your surroundings. And it's the same technology the self driving car would use to make sure it doesn't run into anything or anybody. It creates this digital twin, this replica of everything that's around you. And you can mask everything out of that except for the trees. So you look at this 3D model of trees. You can do this from the street level by car, put the scanner in a car, drive around, map your trees in a matter of days rather than years. You can also put the scanner in a backpack so you can map the trees that are in a park, which might not be accessible to cars. High resolution satellite imagery can also play a huge role in also mapping the trees that a car or a human with a backpack might not have access to, like in people's backyards, for example. And then, of course, you have the huge rise in artificial intelligence, which is changing how we actually organize and how we actually get any sense from all of that data. So I think this is kind of really offering us a way to one, map our cities trees at scale, which we were unable to do before. then actually use that data for something usable. Because we have all these fantastic models that are available that basically say, okay, give me the tree's species, the size, the crown volume, the location, the precipitation data of that area, and I will tell you exactly what that tree does for you in terms of reducing your heating costs, your cooling costs, your what it does for air filtration, carbon sequestration. We have those models. We just don't have the right data. So it provides that data. And thirdly, what I'm most excited about, it actually frees up the time, the limited resources that the tree inventory technician has to be able to send them to the places that really need them. Trees that are in trouble, trees that the lidar scanner isn't able to identify, areas where maybe citizen involvement is more necessary in terms of that tree's health plan. That I think really excites me the most. So we can map trees at scale, we can do something useful with that data, and then we can actually get people involved in the management of those trees as well.
Yeah, you mentioned this is where just that Internet of Nature, it's that evolution applying technology comes really in handy because it's the scale issue, and I think in the book it mentions examples of that also using like soil, sensors in the soil to help figure out which trees need water. Because it can vary, it's not uniform throughout a whole area, which seems
Yep.
like a fantastic idea, especially with climate change and in all the differences that we're seeing. So it's just a great marrying of that technology with the natural world, which I was very happy to learn about. But also, so all these technologies are great for helping maintain and encourage the growth of these great resources, nature and trees around us. And what you also mentioned is just translating that into benefits. Not every, people just like I think take for granted that natural world. But you mentioned all this work by Nature Quant and coming up with a nature score and natural score priority index, which helps to kind of translate into a language a lot of finance people, like people that have to deal with the money side of things and funding, can then quantify and say, oh, like this is the benefit we're seeing. We can actually quantify it, and then it's no longer this resource with no value. It's now got a value, and then we can that I think I see that as a great way to just kind of work into the existing system, which manages a lot of these places. So I, I was very happy to see this, but I'm assuming it helps with funding. Um, is that true?
I would say so because I think even just what I said before of this idea that there are cities around the world that have people that are responsible for green infrastructure for the trees, and they don't even have a database of how many trees they have. It speaks volumes of like just the lag that urban forestry and green infrastructure has had, right? I don't think as urban we would never ever accept this kind of mismanagement, if you can call it that,
Mhm.
of our lighting, our mobility, our transportation networks, our waste management, right? We would never accept that. We'd be on the streets, on strike if, there was garbage piling up or if, the transportation system wasn't working. Yet we've accepted for so long this kind of underfunding of, I would argue, one of the most critical infrastructural assets that we have in our cities because it is literally what is keeping that city livable. If all of the greenery were to disappear overnight in the cities around the world, I would guarantee you people would be on the streets asking for it back. You would notice pretty quick. And that's, I think, the big thing with, as you mentioned, these, new companies coming out like Nature Quant, which have figured out a way to actually not only map exactly, nature deficiency in certain areas, but actually provide that with a value as well and do that, at scale for, on the census tract for the entire states and entire Canada as well. It's offering large organizations the way to actually target those interventions. Because I think previously, if you look at organizations like the Arbor Day Foundation, which does tremendous work at really being able to actually make good on what we want to do and actually plant more trees and do more greening interventions, typically the communities that got hold of those interventions were just the loudest, but we know often the loudest communities are often the wealthier communities because they have time to be loud, and it's not necessarily the communities that need the most. And with something like the nature score priority index, you can see, like rapid fire, what are the census tracts, and even down to like, the quarter mile, granularity, what are nature deficient areas? And can we focus together with community groups on the ground to make sure those trees are wanted? Can we work with those communities in those areas to make sure that we can green those areas? Because we know from research, you're much better off planting 5 trees on a street that has zero than planting 5 trees on a street that already has a bunch. You're going to just see X amount, exponential more benefits in terms of, all these things that we've discussed, shading, evapotranspiration, health benefits. So that I think is really critical. It's not only helping with funding, it's also helping to actually target those interventions.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear because it seems like again to the blindness, it's like without it's like a piece of the puzzle was
Yeah,
missing.
yeah.
So it's in multiple ways. It sounds like that's really kind of like just you just completed it all so that we have this path. So wow, that's interesting. Um, I know we're kind of winding down here, but one of the things that I was became aware of reading the book were all these nature apps that are out now. So now I have a bunch of them downloaded onto my phone. I guess what's your most used nature app? Do you have any one in particular that you find yourself using a lot or your favorite?
I do. I mean, there's a lot, as you said in the book, but my favorite is All Trails. All Trails is an app for those people that aren't familiar. It's an app that essentially shows you all of the hiking and biking and walking trails close to you. And it was an app that I would kind of exclusively use when I was traveling to try to kind of discover great, hiking areas close to where I was traveling to. But during the pandemic, I actually kind of rediscovered it in my own childhood neighborhood. I was, like many people, trapped, if you will, in my childhood home, being between places and having to leave the country. Long story. Essentially, I was back with my parents for about 4 months, which was a wonderful experience, but necessary to get out of the house at times. And All Trails was such a great tool to be able to discover, trails that I didn't even, I lived in that place for 20 years that I didn't even realize
Wow.
existed. And I thought that was just so cool. And I think it's just such a message also for the people listening is there is so much more nature around you than you think, right? And just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. And these kinds of tools like All Trails can really kind of help bring that to the surface, which is one of the reasons why I love it so much.
Ah, well, I also just want to remind folks. So we're here today with Nadina Hala, and we're talking about her book, "The Nature of Our Cities." So definitely, I read this in the last few weeks. Definitely enjoyed this book. But I was wondering, is there anything, any nuggets of information that if you could just leave with folks about what they can do, or what should they take away from this talk um, that we're having here?
Yeah, I mean, if I can build on my All Trails pitch there, I would say first, take stock of what's around you, right? I think there's a lot of wisdom in that old adage of if you don't use it, we lose it. And I think right now as you talked about, Jules, we've become blind to the nature that's around us. So try to discover, I challenge you, try to discover a new hike or a new walking trail or a new park that's close to you. Research shows that the nature that's within a 500-meter radius of our house, about like what is that, a third of a mile, that is critical to our overall health and well-being. So it really is local. It's this beautiful local solution. So once you kind of take stock of what's around you, there's all of these other great apps you can use, like iNaturalist, for example. You can take part in something called the City Nature Challenge, where you can actually meet a bunch of other nature lovers or budding nature lovers around you to actually identify what it is that grows around you to kind of combat a little bit of that blindness. But I would say, don't stop there. Like, look beyond your home. Like, look at things that you can maybe do to green the space where you spend a significant amount of time, like your campus or your kid's school or your office or your place of faith or a community center. All these areas can really benefit from greenery. I think as urban residents, we often feel a little bit at a loss, right? Like maybe you don't even have a balcony. Maybe you just, have no outdoor space whatsoever. So look at these places where we spend significant amount of time, and maybe that are areas where you can bring in greening. And that can take form in, tree planting events, starting a community garden, even just adding potted plants. Like, it seems really trite, but those little things really do make a difference. And I always say, like, you never know who you're inspiring with that, right? somebody might walk along your green, newly green balcony, and honestly, it could brighten their day. You have no idea who you're impacting with those kinds of actions. So I would just encourage you to take action where you can, but most importantly, discover the nature around you and use it.
I love that, Nadina. Thank you so much for your time and talking about your book and just having this conversation. I think it's something I look forward to. All of trying to like green my own area in making progress. So thank you so much, Nadina.
I'm so glad, Jules. Thank you so much.